Hello, everyone. I'm Craig Cummings. I am part of Unicode, and as you can see, I have some interesting titles here. I had given a talk about adding languages to computers and mobile devices a bit back um, a while ago. It needed some updating, so this seemed a good time to present again, and with a greater focus, particularly on Indigenous languages and Indigenous language communities. So, some of you probably know Unicode for emoji. Probably many of you know Unicode for emoji. We'd like you, we're hoping that you would know Unicode for all the world's writing systems. And you can see on this slide that there are a number of writing systems. Those that are uh, in black here, and note Cherokee and Canadian syllabics and some other writing systems for um, Indigenous languages appear on here in black. So we've actually encoded those. Those are a part of Unicode already. Some others you see on this slide are not in Unicode yet, particularly those in red. And it'd be great if actually more people knew that there's more that goes on your devices with Unicode. In fact, every piece of text that you see on your devices is Unicode. Every piece of text on any modern device, anyway. But wait, there's more. Some of these other pieces that you're seeing on the slide here, the date and time when you first turn your phone on, that's actually a Unicode date and time. That little percentage of how much battery life you have left, that's a Unicode number format. Um, and here we can actually see on the left hand side, is English displaying and a date format with English day names and English month names. But next to that is actually uh, the Lakota same date, but now the translations for Wednesday and April are in Lakota. And the rightmost screenshot there is actually the phone displaying those Canadian syllabics for Inuktitut. And part of what makes a lot of that possible is a data piece called the Unicode Common Locale Data Repository, or affectionately abbreviated as CLDR. You can go to the Unicode CLDR project. There's a link at the end, but it's cldr.unicode.org. And you can read all about Unicode CLDR. Now, I will have to say their website's pretty techy. Um, Improvements are still being made, but it's not necessarily the easiest read. What I'm going to try and do here is simplify in this presentation how to get started adding your language. I will have to say one of the improvements that's been made is the adding CLDR data page and the what's needed. It used to be a longer list. It's still kind of an eye chart on this slide, but it's a shorter list. It's an easier list to approach for language communities, particularly if they're not necessarily that technical. Um, and I'm going to try and simplify it here even more. So, to add CLDR data, I like to get started with just a few things here. Several things, four things. The first is an autonym. So the name of the language in that language. And actually, we want the name of that language in English too. So both of these will help where there might be a language selection menu. They will help display that language both in English and in that language. There are other times where the autonym gets used, but having that data is an especially good start at getting things right. Part of the CLDR data includes a place for all the letters of that language. And these are subdivided by CLDR into a few chunks here. There's a main set of letters, which is kind of self-explanatory. An auxiliary set of letters. Now, these can be historical letters. These can also be for other languages, letters of other languages that might be used with the language in question. So it may be the case that, Cherokee is also used with English. So in the auxiliary letter grouping, you could put in the characters of English. And it's often the case that, in some Cherokee text, you're inevitably also going to find some English text as well. Not too uncommon. Anyway, the auxiliary letters are the place for that. Indices, there's a set of index letters. So if you were to turn to the back of a grammar book or a dictionary, you would see a list of letters in a certain order, I might add. And that is the index. That may be an index, and that would be what you would want to have as the letters for the index part of CLDR data. For a number of languages that are Latin-based, the numbers and punctuations ought to look, and then punctuation characters ought to look pretty much the same. But other languages have different numbers, may have different characters for numbers than what we might be used to with, they're actually Arabic numerals, but we'll call them European digits. The typical 1, 2, 3 that we would see on an English keyboard, for example. But those do change for different languages around the world. Some have different numbers, some have different digits. Those are interesting to add to CLDR data as well. And different punctuation is used in different languages. If you were to use Spanish instead of English, you would see questions now have an upside down question mark at one end and a regular direction question mark at the other end. And different languages use different punctuation, so this is not something unusual, but here's the place to specify that. The date format you just saw an example of with one of the previous slides, and you saw that in English and Lakota and Inuktitut. Given how that is the screen, maybe not the most important functionality on your phone, but definitely key and something you see. It's the very first impression that your phone makes with you. So getting date format is kind of important. And having, while optional as part of the getting started CLDR data, the day and month names are important too. And here, I'm sort of getting ahead of things, but once you have some core CLDR data, that basic data to get started, we can get a nicer portal, a web portal working that has a better display of what these things might look like. And this is actually that. And it's called Survey Tool. So the CLDR Survey Tool has this better display of these pieces of CLDR data. And here is the piece for that alphabetic information, the letters. So you see the main letters, the auxiliary letters, the index numbers, and punctuation here for Lakota. Now, in the past, when I presented before, I had suggested that, a good way to start figuring out some of these letters and pieces of the alphabet and the characters that are used for a given language, a good place to start is a dictionary. I have moved to Seattle in the last several years, and the language around Puget Sound is called Lushootseed. So here's the Lushootseed dictionary. And in the first few pages, you can find the letters of that language typically. Most dictionaries or even grammar books, talk about this up front. What is the language going to look like in terms of its characters? Here's the first few characters, because I can't fit all the 43 characters of Lushootseed on one slide here, but here's the first few characters. You see some difference. It doesn't start with A. The first letter for Lushootseed is actually a glottal stop. And you see now there are smaller glottal stops that kind of look like a comma next to certain characters. And so there's some different characters for Lushootseed, as you might expect for a different language. Even though it's a Latin-based, you can see that it's a Latin-based orthography, a Latin-based alphabet. But there are also some caveats about using dictionaries and grammar books and other references like that. For those of you who know me, I am a huge fan of community engagement and reaching out to various language communities and working with them personally so that I know what really is the case. And I am surprised more often than I would care. So here's a surprise for Lashutsi. In the dictionary, you can see over on the left-hand side, here's the dictionary entry when I start getting to the C's. Um, Lashutsi has a type of phoneme, a sound character called an ejective. And this last C here with the comma next to it, a C with a wedge, a hot check C, a ch sound, has this glottal associated with it, which makes it an ejective, and that sounds, and I'm probably not going to get this right, but I'll be hopefully close here. It sounds like ch. You can actually go over here and you can check out on the right-hand side, though, if I work with the community and I reach out to them, and I find out that no, actually, the C ejective is that comma mark actually goes directly over the top of things. And so if you were to go to the Tulalip site here and listen to Lashutseed for the month of May, you would hear that ch sound being made as part of pronouncing May. Anyway, huge fan of community engagement. Definitely reach out to the communities. No one knows their language better than the community itself. So, and they have been great resources for figuring out CLDR, trying to get those languages working better on computers and mobile devices. And I can't speak highly enough to that engagement. Something tells me, though, that I may be presenting at some point in time, just how you go about engaging, finding these communities and engaging with them and working with them to gather CLDR and get their languages working on computers and mobile devices. But that'll be a separate presentation for the future. All right, we talked about main letters and those typically in a dictionary. We talked a little about auxiliary letters earlier. I'm just sort of recapping that. Maybe I'll have another presentation of this where I actually give some really good examples of this. But you heard some, English characters might be a good one, for Lashutseed, because they're going to throw in some English words along with Lashutseed words. There are some other letters as well, and the ordering of these in CLDR is important. CLDR provides data for sorting and sorting functionality on your phone. So if you have a big long list and it's a list of Lashutseed words, you'd like to think it's going to get sorted in the right order. And different languages sort differently, right? And sometimes they have actually multiple sorting orders for just one language. It gets a little more complicated than that. But specifying that earlier in the CLDR data is a great start. And here are the month names. We're back to Lakota. We're looking at the CLDR survey tool again and its display of January through December here. Here's another slide of the day names for Lakota. And if you go back in the recording later and look at the earlier screens of Lakota displaying on your screen on your phone, or you actually set your phone to display Lakota, and you'll see these day names displaying, or these month names displaying for Lakota. It's pretty cool. And definitely, what better way for a community to feel connected to and feel that these devices are useful in their hands than providing this kind of functionality in their language. There are still some gotchas, and one of the questions I had in the past was, how do you handle differences in the letters or differences in dictionary entries, the way words are spelled or things like that. And so actually here again is Lashutseed, and there are actually quite a few different Lashutseed language communities all around Puget Sound that speak that have slight differences. I think there's efforts on some unification, but there are slight differences that can be found in certain, and these are lexical differences. The good news, at least about Lashutseed, is that there aren't any orthographic differences For the most part, though, we saw earlier there's now a historical letter for ejectives. There are historical letters for the ejectives where the comma tends to sit to the right, the upper right, and there's the newer form, or a newer orthographic representation of these ejectives where that comma, that glottal mark for the ejective sits above, directly above, and in the middle of the character. Um, so there are actually orthographic differences for Lashutsi, but here are some lexical differences. You notice that the month names uh, for these two Lashutsi speaking same language, but different words for different months of the year. And the good news is that the technology can work for all these differences. Um, the bad news is that it's not necessarily represented on all those devices as well as we might like yet. So there's still work in progress to get the technology to recognize the data that can be represented and properly represented on all sorts of different devices. So that's in the works. But there's a way to specify that right now in CLDR. There are what are called, there's a practice called the best common practice number 47. And number 47 specifies that a language, a region, minimally a language is needed to differentiate CLDR data. And you can add to that a region, a script, a writing system, and other variations. So we can actually have a variation here for Puyallup, and we can have another variation for Tulalip, and we can tell CLDR to recognize these differences. There's a registration process for some of that, and it's a bit sorted, but it's not that terribly difficult to register these should we decide that we need differences for Lashutsi, and we'll have to see how this language evolves. Will it unify itself, or will there be desire to have some of these differences represented? And the good news, again, the technology can do it. It's just a matter of time before we get all the devices working with that. All right, so there are some other pieces of core data that are not necessarily required by the language community, but working with the language community. We talked about some of these pieces, like this language code, the region, the script, these different variations. And there's some more data that still needs to be collected. And that ends the core data and gets you to that survey tool working. And the survey tool is not just a display mechanism. It actually allows editing and changing and improving the data for a given language. And so you can go beyond just the core data. In fact, it's a requirement to go a bit beyond it to basic level coverage. And there's just less than 100 items. So the number of items previously to get to core data is, you saw, you got some months, month names, day names, some other little pieces of data. The core data is less than 100 pieces. The core data is actually a small number of pieces, right? The basic level number of pieces are also a small number, less than 100 pieces of data, and you're at basic level. And basic level means you can get to the device and you can stay on that device because you've got enough data to do the basics, to function well enough that users would have some appreciation for that. But you can go further with CLDR. By adding yet more strings for all sorts of things like dates and other language names and parts of the world and numbers and other formats. You can contribute a lot more. And the more you contribute, the better that language is going to work on these devices. If the language community wishes to do a greater, take those next steps, like doing full localization of the user interface, for example, that now becomes a possibility with greater levels of CLDR coverage. All right, so getting started, what do you do? we saw that first you need to gather some core data, right? You could file a ticket. There's a ticket system for CLDR that says, hey, I would like to add a new locale for a language like Lashutsi, but somewhere else in Washington. Or I would like to improve something. This is actually, you're looking at a ticket to improve some of the uh, letters for an existing language supported by CLDR already, the language of Chickasaw in Oklahoma. And you can file a ticket. Actually, you could just reach out and contact me and send me that core data, and I can get things started with you and your language community. And at some point, though, that I'm probably going to be a bottleneck, and the ticket mechanism is a little better in that sense that I'm not overwhelmed, and there are other people working on CLDR too, and these languages that can help start taking a look at that and get your language working. So I did talk about basic level. I wanted to have a slide here that sort of talks to that. There's actually a part of the CLDR website that talks about these different coverage levels and the requirements for such. But you can see basic data actually has a lot of things, but still only less than 100 pieces of data for some of these things. And then this is a picture of my MacBook Air and the language selection menu. But other devices, whether you're on Android or you're on a Windows box, there's some setting somewhere that allows you to choose your language of preference. Here I've actually chosen a number of languages, so Apple's kind of cool. It lets me choose several languages. Notice I bumped Lakota up to the top here, sort of to show you that here's what, once you have now the autonym, the name of the language in English, and the name of the language in that language. So here's the name of Lakota over here on the left side, in Lakota itself. And once you have month names and day names, these and some formats for what should numbers look like, what should times look like, what should dates with names of months and days look like, then more functionality starts working for that language. Not only can you see your language listed, but there's functionality now behind it to make, granted, sometimes subtle functionality work, but important functionality. There's maybe at the end of this, I have a link to, there's another presentation on more of the basics, very generic basics of CLDR, and they show a page a search page of results from one of the search engines. I think it was Google. And you'd be surprised just how many things on that page derive its data, like, how long ago some web page was updated, and how many results are found, and the results are sorted in a certain order, and sometimes there's other pieces of functionality going on that are actually that functionality is working because CLDR has been populated with things to make it work. Now, that said, some of these lists for selecting your preferred language can be misleading. I happen to know that Guarani doesn't yet have basic level CLDR data, so only limited things may work here, and it's not necessarily clear to the user of this what's going to work in that language and what may not, what level their CLDR may have been populated such that greater functionality might have been enabled. But this is the start anyway. So CLDR has 2 releases each and every year. So it's a matter of finding the right timing for that community to make their contributions and get started with CLDR. CLDR has this page. Granted, it's a Google Doc page, but it's linked from the CLDR homepage, and I think the linked name is actually current CLDR cycle. So you can see, hey, when's the next time for me to start contributing for my language, or make some changes, and that's this general submission time is probably one of the most important pieces here to look at. And the next one, as you see, will be starting in mid-May. I wanted to talk about there's a couple new pieces of CLDR that I didn't talk about last time. They were still in the works, or they didn't even exist at the time. One of those is that there's now a section of CLDR data for keyboards. So if you've been reading from Translation Commons' website about zero to digital and the basic things that you need to get started if you're digitizing your language and getting that language working on these devices and computers, uh, mobile devices and computers, those are, the characters themselves, your characters in Unicode, if they're not already there, fonts, keyboards, and CLDR data. Well, it turns out that the keyboards and CLDR data pieces are now even more closely linked. And it gets even better than that. Translation Commons has a project team that works on building keyboards for different language communities. And they use a tool called Keyman. Keyman's an excellent development tool, easy to use, and you can bang out keyboards pretty quickly with it. In the newest release, it now has functionality that will output CLDR. So this is really cool. And that CLDR piece is this LDML. LDML is the name of the spec that specifies how keyboard data should be represented to go into CLDR. But this is a great feature and an exciting announcement this year that will help add keyboards more quickly and provide that interoperability between different systems now, so that you can expect more consistent behavior between different devices when you're typing things. All right, credit to BuzzFeed here. I had to have a little fun. The other new and exciting CLDR functionality includes things about spell checking. Here's something, we all have seen spell checking go wrong, and as you might imagine, it especially goes wrong for languages other than English. And so Unicode CLDR has created a new project called Unilex. Unilex allows you to contribute all sorts of data beyond, dates and times and numbers, and month names and letters and things like that. Now you can start doing things for more sophisticated natural language processing and spell checking and more. Actually, that slide's a bit of an eye chart as well. So let's go to the more zoomed in, simplified view of what that screen says about Unilex. So here are the data types that you can now start providing data for, and these then can be used for functionality for things like spell checking and text to speech, speech to text. So that's another exciting realm. There are 7,000 languages of the world, give or take, and while 4,000 of those are written, and so that's kind of Unicode caters to that very well, and so does CLDR. It's been a question about what about the other 3,000? What do you do about them? And text to speech and speech to text is an exciting new realm where some greater representation of these languages can go on for these devices. So here is now a project where you can contribute data that will help that the spoken only languages to work better on these devices as well. So, and a new exciting realm, a new exciting project by CLDR, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Here's the link here, and I think I've got another slide for all sorts of links. And I'm wrapping up my presentation here, but here are a number of things that I talked about. So here's the main CLDR website, how to add new locales, how to figure out which time might be the best time to contribute to CLDR, and a couple new exciting projects going on with CLDR. So I actually have a list of questions that some folks have submitted through the chat here, and I wanted to address those. And one of the questions was what to do about languages that do not yet have an ISO, that's the International Standards Organization code. So, as part of BCP 47, if you recall, language code is required. That's the minimum. Some of these other pieces that are also part of the core data, um, and part of CLDR, those are not required until later. But the language code is. So, what if your language doesn't have a code? What do you do? And we'll try and put, I don't have that link here. We'll try and put that link in the YouTube comments so that you can, ISO has a particular committee that works on the standard for language abbreviations, language codes, and they have a really cool form that you fill out and say, here's my language. It doesn't have a code yet. Could you please help me make one? And they will walk you through that. Another question that I got in the chat are about what next steps. Okay, so if you've got your CLDR data now, what do you do next? And that, I guess, would assume also that you've got your characters and your fonts and your keyboards. And one of the next steps I hear about, or is asked of me when I'm meeting with these language communities, is that they want that spell checker. And so Unilex seems to be a good start or a next step for a number of these communities. But others may, you saw in a slide earlier, okay, I get to basic level coverage in CLDR. What do I do next? What if I want user interface localizations? Well, you contribute more CLDR data and you start working. Unicode's members are these vendors, the Apples, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the list goes on, that make platforms and devices that you might want to be localized in your language, and we can put you in touch with the right people to help make that happen. So there's that opportunity as well. And relatedly, there is a question about, what if your characters aren't in Unicode yet? And there is a presentation on the Translation Commons YouTube channel about encoding new characters and writing systems in Unicode. So I would encourage you to take a look at that one. It's presented by Dr. Debbie Anderson, and Debbie has been doing, she has been encoding languages into Unicode for a very long time and oversees much of all the writing systems that have been encoded in Unicode. So there's a great presentation on the on the Translation Commons channel. You could probably go to the Unicode YouTube channel and find a presentation on that as well. But needless to say, if your character is not in Unicode yet, there's a way to get it in, and there's a number of good presentations on that online, including YouTube. The next question, are there any special skills for querying CLDR? Well, if you can use the web, if you can use the internet, there's this CLDR survey tool that lets you you can look at any locale. You can look at Cherokee right now. By the way, I didn't put the survey tool link here, but it's st.unicode.org, and that will take you to survey tool, st. And that you can browse any of, it's nearing 1,000 languages, some with more CLDR data than others. But there's a very large list, including a number of indigenous languages like Inuktitut, Lakota, and Cherokee, and more that are in CLDR, and you can take a look at those as examples. Or if those happen to be your language and you'd like to contribute more, please do get involved. The next question was about the spoken only languages, and I've talked about those a bit. And another question about should communities wait until they have all the data? And my answer in getting languages to work on computers and mobile devices, the answer has pretty much always been something is better than nothing. So I would encourage you to contribute all that you can, but it doesn't have to be more than the basic level of data. Um, and and while that doesn't get necessarily all the functionality you might ultimately need, it's a great start. So start there. The last question is a very interesting question, and that is how should operating systems deal with and platforms deal with this large set of CLDR data? So, as I mentioned, there's 7,000 languages of the world. Well, let's call it 4,000 written ones that might have some CLDR data. We'll work on the Unilex part of that later. Um, and that's, if each of those has, what did we see? More than 10K pieces of data to get them to a modern level of support in CLDR. It's not a trivial amount of data, and it adds up. It certainly multiplies up very, very quickly at 4,000 languages of the world. That Now it's going to be a significant size or piece chunk of information on that platform. Well, the interesting thing is there's a number of interesting things. One is that most users are not polyglots. They don't speak typically more than one language for much of the world. There are certainly a lot of places where people do speak more than one language, but maybe only a couple, maybe a few. And then there's a very small percentage of people who are polyglots, who may work with lots of languages or just naturally have that gift for languages, and may want a number of these working on their devices. So, should the devices have all of these languages on there when only one or a handful of them are needed? Not necessarily. And there's a number of creative solutions that are being bantied about. I've heard things about, compressing the data. I've heard things about splitting the data up into certain chunks. There has always been some tiering going on. And maybe that's the best, or maybe that's not the best solution. One of the best ones that I had a hand in putting forward, but as much as I'd like to claim this is my great idea, it's not. So credit where credit is due. A number of people have had the clever idea of what about having that data in the cloud or stored elsewhere, such that at a certain time, when you make these language preferences, it's pulled in as needed. Um, and and that might be a good solution as well. We're gonna there's some smart people working on this problem, and I'm sure we're gonna come up with some good solutions you know, without bloating operating systems or slowing them down because there's lots of data loading going on, or making websites slower because there's extra overhead for things that may not be needed. Um, so there are greater efficiencies to be had there, and probably some clever ways of working with large sets now. If we're going to be adding a good more number more a good number more languages, then that's going to be a chunk of data. But it's all, as I said, in most cases it's only a small portion of that data is needed. That sort of ends the questions that I have, and I would welcome any other questions that folks might have. I will try and answer those on that might end up being comments on the YouTube channel, and tune back in to other interesting Translation Commons presentations and what the channel might be doing. And thank you all for your time. Do contribute, and your language will be working better. Thank you.